journey of Jesus towards interculturality. This could be a much longer talk. So what we're getting today is just a snapshot. Okay? All right. So if we think of Jesus, the Word made flesh, Jesus was a person of his own culture. As a child, he had to learn the language, learn his religion, learn the culture and everything. And so he grew up in a very particular geographical area of the world, the Holy Land, Israel. One of my sisters and her husband are there right now, doing a pilgrimage there. Yeah. Anyways, so Jesus was a person of the flesh. He is fully human and fully divine. So as a human being, when he was raised, he also was brought up with his own understanding of his culture, which included some prejudice towards others. Prejudice is not a sin. Prejudice is what we naturally have. Prejudice becomes a sin when we use it to judge people and to treat them in unjust ways, when we do it in that way. So we all have our prejudices. In other words, prejudgments when we encounter people in that way. So there are three particular icons of Jesus' journey. And I'm giving credit to Sister Adriana Milmanda. She's an Argentinian sister that I work with a lot. And she's the one that did a lot of work in this first section regarding Jesus. Later on is where I picked up. We were together in the Philippines now. She came from Argentina for the 3-week program I did there on interculturality. So I want to give a footnote to Adriana, give her credit for this. So there were three very iconic moments of Jesus. I'm not going to go through all all the scripture because we're familiar with that, and I don't have time to go through all that. But we're familiar with the stories. The first one was with the Canaanite woman, also known as the Syrophoenician woman in the other gospel. So she was somebody of a different culture than Jesus. She was a Gentile, and she called out to Jesus. She called out to Jesus, and Jesus at first ignored her with silence. His disciples said, after a while, we'll move her on, and Jesus said, I'm here for the lost sheep of Israel. That's my focus that I'm here for. But the woman was very insistent. As a good mother, parent, concerned for her daughter, she was very insistent. And she didn't play the victim card. She was very insistent in what she wanted to do. So she kept pressing Jesus for curing for her own daughter. And Jesus even used a derogatory term, using the term of pigs. We don't feed food to the pigs. And that's something he learned. I mean, that comes out of his own culture. It's a derogatory term that was used for the Gentiles. And some people are not comfortable when I say this because they say, Jesus, how could he use a term like that? Well, he was also human. He is fully human. But he didn't stop there because eventually he recognizes that God is working with the woman, and he says, oh, no greater faith have we found. So, in other words, to me, Jesus is a great example of someone who was able to face his prejudice. And again, this may hurt your ears when I say that, but face it, not his sin. He was without sin, but he faced his prejudice that he grew up with in his own culture, but he overcame it. And that's what we're about. We have our prejudices, but how do we overcome it in that way? And so Jesus was changed. So, as a result of this encounter with the Canaanite woman, Jesus grew in his own understanding of the inclusivity and radical equality of God's reign. So Jesus knew God, Abba, very closely. He knew about God's reign when he first preached in his hometown. The reign of God is present as I talk to you. He's about that. But again, he had a certain understanding of what that would mean. And now through this encounter with the Canaanite woman, he realized that God's reign meant stepping outside the Jewish community, going outside to the Gentiles and to a woman in that way, and overcoming his own prejudice in that way, not his sin, but his prejudice, he was able. So I think what we see here is an outsider who helps to open up the Word of God for us even wider, because she was somebody from the outside, outside of his own culture. This is a very powerful story. Sometimes we spend an hour just on this, but I'm just giving you a snapshot today. You're getting the cliff notes, just the notes in this way. Very powerful story of Jesus. A second was that of the Samaritan woman at the well. Again, a Gentile, a woman. He goes to the well, he encounters this woman, and she asks him, why are you, a Jewish man, talking to me, a Samaritan woman? So it's not just cultural, but also gender barriers. So he reaches out to her, and they talk about her personal life, her marriage life. Eventually they talk about their theology, where do they worship, looking for the Messiah. He does great conversation. So this was a conversation that Jesus initiated. And the other one, it was a Canaanite woman. She's the one that started the conversation. She was the one that was first saying, hey, I got my daughter sick, help me. In this case, Jesus encounters her and they have this conversation. So Jesus again is encountering a person who he should be talking to, as a Gentile and as a woman at this time. And there's just the two of them at that time. So what happens is, as they get to the end of that, and again, we don't have time to go through the whole incident or the whole event. At the end, Jesus says, Samaritans, you worship on the mountains, the high places. Jews worship in the temple. But God calls us both to worship God in spirit and in truth. Both worship God in spirit and truth. So what happens here is that you have people of two different worlds, two different gardens, if you want to use that imagery, coming together, and they find something in common. Even though their religion was different, culture, gender, but they were able to find a common space in which they could identify and both be nourished by. Because the woman was so excited, she left her jar and went to the town to tell people what happened. It was so significant for her. So in that encounter between someone who's different, rather than either your way or my way, but is there something that we can share together, the both and? How do we find that common space between us in that way? And where we find God, in spirit and in truth. Yeah, we don't have time today to talk about both ecumenism and interreligious and all those things, but that's also another category of us and them, other religion, other Christian denomination, but the same sort of principles, how God is working amongst all peoples, so how are we enriched and challenged in that way? How Jesus, in his life, had to overcome his own prejudice as a human to realize that God's grace was going to the Gentiles as well. Not just to the Jewish peoples, but also to the Gentiles. So he had to overcome his own, as a cultural person, in his own culture, how God is working amongst all peoples. And that's what we're talking about today in that way. So we talked about the Samaritan woman, we talked about the Canaanite woman, and the third here is the Good Samaritan story. So here we have the Good Samaritan. Here's somebody who's between Jericho, a dangerous route between Jericho and Jerusalem, who is beat up, left along the side of the road. A priest and another person, they go past, they don't go across the road to help. But who's the one that's the good disciple? A Samaritan. It's unbelievable. Jesus used an outsider to talk about the perfect disciple. So he didn't pick a Jewish person. He said it was this Samaritan who did the right thing. That did the right thing. There was, showed the compassion for a person in need that they did not know. And they went beyond the call of duty. They help, take someplace, here's extra money if you need it, things like that. So again, it's amazing that Jesus used an outsider, a foreigner, as a perfect disciple. So how Jesus is already showing how that reign of God is going way beyond our categories of us and them. Any categories we have. Tony Gittins, who I quoted earlier this morning, has a very strong statement here. He says, because humanity has become so scandalously separated and opposed with our different divisions and violence, we individually and corporately must make a choice. Either we choose to continue sinning by exclusion, separation, and boundary maintenance, and every day eat and drink judgment to ourselves. So that's one choice that we continue as is. Or we resolve today to embrace God's radical option for humanity, and with God's help and our steadfastness, to change our lives. There's no third way. Either we continue just doing this or we have to make serious choices. And again, this is something through our whole lifetime we do, huh? Yeah, it's not a one-time deal. So these are three particular moments in Jesus' life. I just touched on briefly, little snapshots. The other area for Jesus, reaching out beyond the boundaries, is within the Jewish culture. They had their rules about table fellowship. And they needed this for their own identity when they were moving amongst different peoples. This morning I talked about those three things: meaning, identity, and order. So the Jewish culture also had to provide meaning, identity, and order, their own identity. That's what every culture does, huh? And so for them it had to do with their foods, pure and impure foods, and how to eat and things like that. Now Jesus, he was not against his culture, but he was against a strict interpretation of that table fellowship. As I mentioned this morning, there's no perfect culture, no Christian culture. Every culture has both seeds and weeds, good and bad, in every culture. Huh? And so in his own culture, there were some people who were using their culture in a way to be very exclusive in who they would allow, to who they would interact with. So in Luke's gospel, he has three encounters of table fellowship. With the tax collector was Jewish, but he's considered on the boundaries because of his job. He worked for the enemy, for the people who were in charge. Huh? The woman who was considered a sinner washed his feet. Again, because of that situation, she was considered impure. Huh? And in the home of Zacchaeus, also for Jesus to go. Huh? So Jesus reached out in table fellowship amongst his own people also. The first three stories were with Gentiles. These are with fellow Jews. Tony Pernia wrote this quote. He is a Filipino SVD. He was the first non-European born Superior General of our community 20 years ago now, huh? Tony Pernia. So he wrote, the primary image Jesus used for the table was for the kingdom. The primary image Jesus used for the kingdom or the reign of God was table fellowship. The subject of many of his parables, the object of his many meals he shared with outcasts and sinners. Through this image, Jesus announced that God was inviting everyone without exception, to communicate with God. Huh? This is what we are about with the reign of God. This is like the scriptural basis of what we were talking about this morning. This morning we focused more on sort of the sociological and the imageries and stuff, a little bit of the theology. And here we're talking about this is why we do what we do. Huh? So Tony Gittins has this chart here. He says, Tony Gittins, anthropologist, died a month ago. So he talks about there are us, them categories. Within the us, there are those who are the participants in that culture. So in our own culture, those who are participating. But in our own culture, there are insiders in our culture that don't really participate. People who are considered because of mental or children or certain people are not considered part of our culture, huh? Marginalized within our own culture. Then when you cross that line to the other side, to the them side, when you cross over here, I shouldn't move, should I? I should stay here because they're filming me. Okay, I'll stay here. On the other side to them, you have those who are participating in the other culture and those who are not participating. So the first three stories we looked at today, Jesus already crossed the line into the Gentile world. When he was talking with the Samaritan woman and the Syrophoenician woman, he's with the non-participant outsiders. In their own culture, how women were treated at that time. Huh? Now, when he talked about the Samaritan man, then he was talking about somebody who was most likely participant. We don't know exactly who he was, or in a parable. Huh? So Jesus crossed that border, those participating, non-participating. In his own culture, Jesus started out here with his teaching, being a male in his society. But through table fellowship, he crossed the line. Huh? He included women, the tax collectors, Zacchaeus, those in his own culture. So in other words, that reign of God is, taken up with Jesus, and he realized that it's beyond his human categories. First of all, crossing to the Gentiles, those within. He also had the Roman centurion who would have been a participant outsider in a other culture, centurion. Huh? So Jesus crossed that line over there, and within his own culture, he challenged the culture there. Huh? Okay, so that's the sort of the sociological perspective, what Jesus is doing for the sake of the reign of God. Are you with me so far? Is that okay? Yeah, I know some of you weren't with me this morning, so we covered. Well, we sort of laid the groundwork for some of this. Okay. So now, what's going to happen to the early church? How are they going to follow what Jesus did here? Huh? So, in another work that I've done with a colleague of mine, we've looked at Acts of the Apostles and put together 7 stages. We don't have time this afternoon to go through those 7 stages. I'm just going to go through 5 and 7. We're just going to go through a couple of them for time. But again, this is how we moved through Acts of the Apostles from the mission of Jesus to becoming a church. It's also, when we became church, that meant we had to step outside the Jewish bounds. Huh? So I'm just going to focus in on that aspect here, not all the other parts of Acts. Okay? So we jump forward to stage 5, anyways, I'm tempted to go back, but we don't have time for that probably. So, or maybe I'll just say real quick. I'm sorry. At the beginning, the early Christian community, they're all getting along well with each other. They're sharing the food, living very nicely. But very soon, in Acts of the Apostles, there starts to be a conflict between 2 groups of Jewish Christians. One were the Hebrews. They were the ones in Israel. They spoke that language of the Holy Land. And there were those of the diaspora, meaning they lived in the Roman Empire where Greek was the language. So, and there were many. There was about 10% of the Roman Empire were Jewish. They lived all around. For example, in Rome, they lived in an area called Trastevere. That was where the Jewish community lived at that time. So amongst the Jewish Christians, you had those who had come in from outside, and they were Greek-speaking, and they lived in a different world because they lived out in the world, in the Roman Empire. And then there were the Hebrew-speaking Jewish Christians. They're both Christians, both Jewish Christians. But then amongst them, they had conflicts because they found out that the widows of the Hellenists, those of the Greek-speaking, they were not getting their fair share of food and care as the others. Huh? So already within the Jewish Christian community, they had some differences, that they weren't equal food and things like that for the widows and children. So what did they do? They got together as a community and said, okay, we've got a conflict here we got to deal with because God is calling us to be one family. Huh? So then they appointed 7 diakoni, 7 deacons, the early deacons at that time, to serve the table, and Stephen and Philip were 2 of the 7. So then they were appointed to take care of the distribution of the food equally amongst all the members of the Jewish Christian community. So already in the Jewish Christian communities, we're not to the Gentiles yet, there was differences, linguistic differences, cultural difference, social, and even theological, but I can't get into that today. Because they grew up in different worlds. So even there, they had to then get over that as a community and say, now what are we going to do? They appointed 7 diakoni, deacons. At that time, deacons were more with the care of others, not so much liturgical at that time, because it's very simple house churches at that time. Yeah, I had to tell that story. It's one of the stages I was going to skip, but I felt it's important to recognize that they already had to deal with diversity within the Jewish Christian community before the Gentiles come in. Okay? All right, I can talk more about all this stuff, but anyways, I just felt it was important to add that. So now we're going to go to stage 5 with Peter. So Cornelius is definitely a Gentile. Now other things have happened in the earlier chapters. We're not going over those. Roman centurion, so he would have been somebody of the others, a participant, outsiders. So he's definitely a centurion, gentle, a man of prayer. He's praying. And in that, he's invited, he said, you should call upon Peter, who's in a nearby town, to come. He has something. So he's a searching person, in that way. At the same time, while Cornelius was in prayer and he was being called to a type of conversion to become a follower of Jesus, Peter was also being called to a conversion. His conversion was not to be a follower of Jesus. He's already in that process, huh? But he was called to think about how God is present amongst all peoples, not just with the Jewish peoples, and that he was called to go outside of his comfort zone and to go. And so in that vision, the picture here is not that clear, but from the scripture, Acts of the Apostles, there's a vision of, a cloak with all these animals, and he's told to eat. And in his table fellowship, he said, it's unthinkable. So he's told, Sir, so I'm on this line right down here. Sir, it's unthinkable. I've never eaten anything unclean or impure in my life. I'm a good Jew. I've followed all the rules. But then, in this line here, I should have reversed the order. This line here, the following line 15, what God has purified, you're not to call unclean. Yeah? So anyways, the vision he received was that God is calling all peoples, not just the Jewish peoples. Yes, the Jewish peoples, but beyond. Then, on the other side now, so you have something special happening both with Peter and Cornelius. So God's working on both sides, right? God's Spirit is there for both the Jews and the Gentiles. Now the messengers come and they invite Peter to come to his house. They were guests in his house, so he's already sort of starting to break the rules of having Gentiles in his house. We don't know if he fed them. We don't know that. So then Peter goes to the home of Cornelius, and it's a household. In those days, it wasn't just a nuclear family. It was a bigger group of people living together, more social-centric. And Peter realized that it's not proper for a Jew to associate with a Gentile, but Peter also knew that, quote, God has made it clear no one should call anyone unclean or impure. I call this a conversion on Peter's part too. Huh? I'll explain a little bit in a moment. Peter later said, God does not have favorites, but anyone of any nationality who fears God and does what is right is acceptable to God. Huh? Peter stayed, and he apparently ate with them. Later he's going to get in trouble for that, huh? The eating part. Huh? So he was eating with the Gentiles in that way. So I refer to this as a conversion of Peter from ethnocentrism. To realize that God is bigger than our social categories. People that we marginalize because of physical or mental disabilities, or people we marginalize because of the color of their skin, because of the church they go to. But to realize that God's grace is working with all. Huh? So how do we recognize that, even to the Gentiles? Huh? So when Peter went back to Jerusalem, people accused him. So you've been visiting the uncircumcised and eating with them, have you? So they are more worried about him eating with the Gentiles and baptizing them. It was more the cultural question that they had at that time. Huh? The baptism was not a major issue. And Peter said, who is I to stand in God's way? God's Spirit was moving that early church. And as we know, Peter, as a leader in that church, this is very significant, huh? In that way. So when the people heard this, they stopped objecting and instead began to glorify God in these words. If this be so, then God has granted life-giving repentance even to the Gentiles. I don't know how well you can see this image here, but God in unexpected places. Huh? So God was coming through the cracks in this event, huh? Tapping with the Gentile community, huh? With Cornelius and his household. Good. Welcome back. Welcome. There we are. Good. Welcome. Yeah, welcome. So we're just looking through Acts of the Apostles to see how the early church moved from being a Jewish community to including the Gentiles. Interculturality, engaging, how God is working with all peoples. Huh? Okay. So this is what happened with Peter. Now, I'm skipping one stage in Antioch, but that's okay. So in stage number 7, we now move to another important time for the church. They had a council in Jerusalem. This was the council of the early Christian community. The people now were called Christians. In Antioch, they began calling them Christians now. And now they come together as a council of the church. The issue is, do the men need to be circumcised as Gentiles if they become followers of Jesus? And do they need to follow our table rules, table fellowship rules? So they heard about what Peter said with Cornelius and the household. Paul and Barnabas came back from Antioch saying, the Gentiles are the ones who are responding. They're the ones, they're coming in big numbers now. They want to be followers of Christ. So they're like, wow, now what do we do as a church now? And so they're asking the question as a church, so as a community, how are we going to deal with this in that way? And eventually, after time, we don't know how many days this council went, how long it took, how many conversations. Eventually, James, who is the leader of the community at that time, of the Christian community, says God is taking from among the Gentiles a people to bear God's name. Yeah. Certainly over the years, the Jews had bore God's name, but they realized the Jews bore the sake of the nations. And now it's clear to them that God is calling all peoples, not just in our categories of before. We cannot imagine how hard this was for good Jews to say, we're good Jews, how can we open our doors? But Jesus has called us into something new, and God is calling other people also to something new. Yeah. Peter and Paul, we just celebrated the feast of Peter and Paul the other day. It's 11th day the other day. So I call this the conversion of the church from ethnocentrism. So it happens on an individual basis, as Peter did with Cornelius, but it also happens for our community. So dealing with prejudice is not only our individual prejudices, but it's that of the community, a town, a parish, a neighborhood, a church, a diocese, the whole church. We have our own prejudices, our own society of the divine word. We have some prejudices going around. Yeah. So how do we, as a congregation, deal with our own prejudice within our religious congregation? Because if we don't deal with it from within, how can we dare try to deal with it outside? We've got to deal with our own stuff. Again, we're human beings, born in certain countries and that, so we've got to deal with what our prejudice is that prevents us from seeing all peoples as our sisters and brothers and treating them in that way. So it happens both on an individual basis, but also as a community and as a parish. So this is to continue. So I don't know about you, but as a child, I remember going past a very still pond, and you take a little stone and you throw it in the middle, and you see the ripples go out. Yeah, see the ripples go out. So just to imagine Jesus as that pebble rock, as they say, the rock, and then in Acts of the Apostles. First of all, between the Hellenists and the Hebrew Jewish Christians. Then as we move out, they went to the Samaritans, the Ethiopian eunuch, to Cornelius' household, to Antioch, and then to the ends of the world, as they knew the world at that time. Ethiopia was the end of the world at that time, because it was outside the Roman Empire, going to the continent of Africa. Those Christians also spread. They went beyond the Roman Empire. And that's a course that I teach about how Christianity spread going east. There's already Christians in northern Afghanistan in 225. They were up in Armenia. They were spread. In India, they got on the right boat and they went to India. There were already Jewish communities in India at the time of Jesus. So when Thomas and others went there, yeah. So the word of God spread, so those ripples. So we are still part of that rippling. What is the ripples what's the new areas of ways in which we as individuals and as church need to step outside of our comfort zone because God is calling us. God's grace is with all peoples. This takes a big challenge. Yeah. So this challenge, the call to conversion towards interculturality, we look at the encounter Peter had with Cornelius. No one should call anyone unclean or impure. God does not have favorites. This movement is a lifelong conversion process for all Christians, all parishes, all religious congregations. And the heart motivation is our spirituality for intercultural life and mission. This morning we talked about in terms of love. Love is at the core because of the love that we have. That is what draws us out because God's love is there. God is calling us. Love is not called to be bottled up. It's the lamp that's on the one that you can see light, huh? And therefore, that love is at the heart of this interculturality. The love of God is not just for ourselves, certainly through that, but beyond us to all peoples. God is bigger than we know. God's Spirit is moving beyond us in all ways. Huh? Okay. So I talk about 3 different movements in a lifelong process of conversion or transformation. Okay? One is the first, what we normally think about conversion from egoism to being Christ-centered. Huh? How do we do that? We know about that. Huh? That's an ongoing life journey in that way. The second, from ethnocentrism, where we battle in God with our categories, our human categories, to interculturality. Someday there might be another word for that, but that's the word we use today. And the third area of conversion, which is rather new in some ways, not new, but to our consciousness, where Pope Francis says we need a conversion from consumerism to care of creation. He talked about this in 2015. Huh? Consumerism, where we think goods and our life here is more important than people. Huh? Things are more important than people. Huh? So we need to move from consumerism in that way to care of creation. And I was talking earlier with some of you. This is something that's very strong with indigenous peoples around the world. I've been working with indigenous peoples from many, many years, from the time I was in Papua New Guinea, living there back in the 70s. Now in the United States, the last 33 years with the Lakota people there. This is my 3rd time here to Alice. I'll go to Tiwi Island tomorrow. When I'm in the Philippines, I go to indigenous community there. I'm just trying to learn from them, because for most indigenous peoples, all that I know of, but I can't say all because I don't know for sure, but they have this connection with the ground, the land, huh? The importance of all creation. Huh? So to me, I consider all 3 of these as movements. Now, we focused in on the second today. We could have retreats about the first, but we talk about the second here today. But I want to include this third also, especially since I'm in Alice Springs, in the center here. Huh? So, in the Vatican document on mission, the 2nd paragraph, it talks about how God's Spirit is stirring from the very beginning. God's Spirit, or God, is pouring out into all creation and all the world and drawing everything back to God. Huh? So God's Spirit is bigger than the Catholic Church. God's Spirit is bigger, because we can't know. God can't be contained in just one way. Certainly within the Catholic Church. And we are to be the sacrament. Huh? We witness to God's reign. That's what we are to do. Huh? But God's is bigger, calling all peoples back to God, huh? And all creation. So when we're drawn back to God, we are to be transformed. When we go back to God, we are to be converted in the process. And I think of it now in terms of 3 areas, or 3 movements. One is from egoism to being Christ-centered, drawing back to God. However people do that. Some people can do that without explicitly calling Jesus' name, but to move out of egoism, Christ-centered. The second, from our ethnocentrism, putting God into our cultural boxes, to interculturality, God is calling all peoples. The banquet that we hear about. And therefore, calling all creation, our relationship with all creation is also being drawn back to God. Huh? The third area is one that I continue to be challenged by and figure out exactly, but a lot of people now are talking about that. And certainly with my work with indigenous, but not just indigenous, within the Catholic Church, many more people are reflecting on this today, huh? In that way. And this is not a linear, it's not like I do number 1 today, number 2 tomorrow, number 3. They're all deepening, huh? As we go. So it's spiral and not linear. So this calls us all to a conversion. Sometimes when I do these workshops, normally when I do a 2-3 week workshop, we always have a reconciliation service in the evening and stuff like that to reconcile in terms of all these 3 areas called to conversion. This picture I have here, I'm with Mercy Benson. She's a Ghanaian from Ghana, sister, SSPS sister, and we were at doing a workshop in Nemi, which is outside of Rome, an SPD house there, and we were doing a 2-week workshop on interculturality, and this was sort of during a ritual of hand washing, sort of the asking for cleansing of our sins, huh? So this was an exercise that we were doing at that time. Men and women gathered there together. So I think we're all called to this ongoing process of conversion. Like I said, as I go on in life, in my 70s now, there's new areas of these us-them categories that I keep bumping into. My own prejudices in that way, one after another. So how do I continue to allow God's grace to help me to see all peoples? My 14-year-old nephew is autistic. God loves him as much as he loves me with a doctorate degree. It's not about education or anything. God's love for all peoples, huh? And how we see others, huh?